I am announcing Canada will be responding to the U.S. trade action with 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods. Tariffs against Canada will put your jobs at risk, potentially shutting down American auto assembly plants and other manufacturing facilities. They will raise costs for you, including food at the grocery stores and gas at the pump. They will impede your access to an affordable supply of vital goods crucial for U.S. security, such as nickel, potash, uranium, steel, and aluminum. If President Trump wants to usher in a new golden age for the United States, the better path is to partner with Canada, not to punish us.
Following Donald Trump's re-election in November 2024, Canada has significantly recalibrated its economic and diplomatic stance toward the United States. The return of aggressive U.S. trade measures, including a 25% tariff on various Canadian imports and a 10% levy on Canadian energy exports, sparked deep concern across Canada's political and business landscape. The tension escalated after Trump made a provocative statement, implying Canada could become the 51st U.S. state, widely condemned as disrespectful to Canadian sovereignty. In response, Canada has pursued export diversification, especially in crude oil, which remains heavily intertwined with the American market. As outlined during a Canadian government meeting on June 2nd, this diversification push comes amid entrenched trade dynamics. In early June 2025, Canada's heavy crude benchmark, Western Canadian Select, WCS, traded at around $52.24 per barrel, compared to $60.79 for West Texas Intermediate, WTI, resulting in an $8.55 price gap due to WCS's density and transport constraints. The U.S. capitalizes on this discount by importing Canadian oil at lower prices and occasionally reselling it at global market rates, earning an estimated $19 billion annually. Canada's export infrastructure has long been U.S.-focused. By mid-2024, Canada was shipping 4.3 million barrels per day to the U.S., up from 3.8 million in 2023, covering around 60% of American crude imports, mostly via Enbridge's Mainline and the Trans Mountain Pipeline. In 2023, 97% of Canada's crude oil exports, valued at roughly $130 billion, were sent to U.S. refineries. Attempts to expand beyond the U.S. have encountered repeated roadblocks. Major proposed pipelines such as Energy East and Northern Gateway were shelved due to environmental opposition, regulatory obstacles, and Indigenous rights concerns. However, the completion of the Trans Mountain Expansion, TMX, in May 2024 increased capacity from 300,000 to 890,000 barrels daily, providing improved access to Asian markets. Still, TMX faces limitations, and any future expansions may encounter the same political, social, and environmental hurdles. In terms of natural gas, Canada exported all of its gas, averaging 5.2 billion cubic feet per day in 2023, to the U.S., rising slightly to 5.4 billion in early 2024. Most of this supply is piped to the U.S. West and Midwest, with infrastructure such as the BC-Washington Interconnect carrying up to 1.9 billion cubic feet daily into the Pacific Northwest. Liquefied natural gas, LNG, exports from Canada to the U.S. remain modest. Tilbury LNG has exported only small amounts so far. But that's changing. LNG Canada began its cool-down phase in March 2025 and aims to export 14 million tons annually by mid-20. Meanwhile, Canada's government is doubling down on plans to boost global energy exports and streamline project approvals. On June 2nd, Prime Minister Mark Carney held a summit in Saskatoon with all 10 provincial premiers, focusing on reducing Canada's dependence on U.S. markets and accelerating infrastructure approvals. Carney criticized the current 10-year average approval process for major energy and mining projects, instead advocating for a 2-year cap for strategically significant initiatives. His goal? To instill certainty, stability, and ambition, that can unlock vast investment and position Canada as a leading energy powerhouse. Carney emphasized that Canada must Trump-proof its economy, making it resilient against future U.S. policy shocks. He listed key projects for fast-tracking, including Nunavut's Grays Bay Road and Port, Ontario's Ring of Fire Mineral Corridor, Alberta's $20 billion Pathways Alliance for carbon capture, and new tidewater-bound oil pipelines. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, representing a province that produces 70% of Canada's oil, pitched a grand bargain, a privately funded pipeline carrying 1 million barrels daily to British Columbia, estimated to yield $20 billion annually, in exchange for $10 to $20 billion in carbon reduction investments from Alberta's oil sands sector. Smith said this deal could fund critical emissions reduction technologies, supporting national climate goals while expanding energy reach. Carney welcomed Smith's proposal, stressing any new pipeline must carry decarbonized oil and align with the national interest. Ontario Premier Doug Ford called the meeting the most productive in a decade, praising the government's national-scale vision. However, he noted that no final decisions were made, joking that Carney's proposal-filled briefcase resembled Santa's sled awaiting summer review. While some premiers voiced support, British Columbia's Nikki Sharma opposed any new pipelines, favoring renewable alternatives. Indigenous groups and environmental advocates demanded stronger consultation and emissions commitments. Carney reaffirmed the need for Canada to decarbonize oil production and support a green transition. Beyond energy, the premiers also addressed reducing interprovincial trade barriers to stimulate GDP growth and national economic cohesion. With projects like the TMX, LNG Canada, and Woodfibre LNG, Canada aims to transform from a US-dependent supplier to a global energy contender. The government's focus now lies in balancing environmental commitments with economic resilience and export diversification amid an increasingly uncertain North American trade landscape. British Columbia's Deputy Premier, Nikki Sharma, reaffirmed her province's long-standing resistance to the development of any new bitumen pipeline across British Columbia, pointing out that there is currently no active proposal for such an initiative, and emphasizing that the provincial government's resources and attention should stay firmly focused on projects that are already shovel-ready. She stated that there are disagreements with Alberta about the need for a new pipeline, highlighting BC's preference for investing in renewable energy transmission infrastructure and developing critical mineral supply chains. Meanwhile, Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew floated the idea that, in the longer term, exporting Canadian resources via a northern route to Hudson Bay might emerge as a feasible pathway to reach international waters. Although he acknowledged the practical difficulties, including the fact that Churchill Port remains icebound for much of the year. Such a route would, according to Kinew, necessitate considerable investment from the private sector and creative problem-solving to overcome logistical challenges. In the Atlantic provinces, the premiers of New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island underscored the urgent need to enhance connectivity with the rest of Canada through better natural gas and electricity interconnections, arguing that reducing internal trade barriers and boosting energy infrastructure could help stabilize prices in the Maritimes. Before diving deeper into the various aspects of this multi-layered policy discussion, we invite you to support our work by liking this video, engaging in the comments with your thoughts, whether supportive, critical, or offering a new perspective, and subscribing to stay informed. Indigenous leaders and rights groups expressed concern over the fast-tracking of project approvals, warning that any process that bypasses meaningful consultation with Indigenous communities could result in legal confrontations. Mark Carney, addressing those concerns directly, stressed that honoring Indigenous rights is non-negotiable and pledged that any project deemed of national interest would still require thorough and respectful consultation. Environmental advocates also raised red flags, cautioning that prioritizing economic expansion should not come at the cost of Canada's climate objectives. A spokesperson from Environmental Defence Canada acknowledged the rationale behind lessening reliance on the US market, but urged the government to ensure that any new approvals are explicitly linked to measurable emissions reductions. Carney responded by citing the Pathways Alliance, a collaborative effort by Canadian oil sands producers to achieve net zero emissions, as an example of how economic and environmental objectives can coexist. Beyond the topic of resource corridors, there was considerable discussion among premiers about the need to dismantle interprovincial trade restrictions that hamper economic efficiency. Carney asserted that eliminating internal trade barriers is just as crucial as opening new international markets, arguing that greater cooperation among provinces could spur innovation, job growth, and economic resilience. Ontario Premier Doug Ford echoed that sentiment, stating the importance of allowing goods and energy to move seamlessly across provincial borders without unnecessary regulatory obstructions. Quebec Premier François Legault emphasized the necessity of aligning regulatory frameworks in both of Canada's official languages. Carney committed to presenting a preliminary framework for national interest designations by mid-July and said the federal government would publish comprehensive guidelines detailing the kinds of projects eligible for streamlined review. A rapid review office would become operational by early August, coordinating among federal, provincial, and Indigenous authorities to ensure that project assessments are completed within 24 months. Each province and territory has until July 15 to submit up to 3 project nominations for consideration, including proposals from the Northern Territories. Carney aims to reconvene all premiers and key stakeholders in Ottawa in late September to evaluate the progress of these submissions and refine the implementation framework. This renewed sense of urgency follows U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement of a dramatic increase in steel tariffs to 50%, an external shock that has heightened the need for Canada to diversify its trade relationships. Carney remarked that Canadian prosperity cannot be left at the mercy of unpredictable foreign policy decisions, reinforcing the need for greater domestic and international economic independence. He further elaborated that he supports the idea of building a new oil pipeline to access overseas markets, so long as it is matched with substantial green investments aimed at lowering the environmental footprint of Canada's energy exports. Following his meeting with provincial leaders, Carney reiterated that decarbonizing Canada's oil sector is a national priority and said the government is exploring a new crude export route that would lessen the country's dependence on the United States, which imports around 4 million barrels per day from Canada. There was a shared understanding among provincial leaders about the importance of developing both western and northern corridors for resource transportation, with general support for creating a new oil pipeline to access tidewater. Currently, Canada's only pipeline capable of moving oil the ocean is the Trans Mountain Pipeline, TMX, recently expanded to accommodate approximately 900,000 barrels per day. Building an additional pipeline, however, would face significant challenges, including opposition from British Columbia and the likelihood of legal resistance from Indigenous groups whose traditional lands might be affected. All 13 provincial and territorial leaders submitted proposals for projects, ranging from electric transmission lines to mining operations and port expansions, hoping to receive the national interest designation that qualifies them for accelerated review. This summit was the initial step in Carney's broader plan to decrease Canada's economic dependency on the United States by bolstering domestic infrastructure and cultivating diversified trading partnerships. Carney reiterated that while Canada continues to seek smoother trade relations with President Trump, it is imperative that the nation take control of its own economic future by eliminating internal barriers and investing in ambitious national infrastructure. A clear understanding of why Canada has struggled to export more oil globally begins with analyzing the country's existing pipeline infrastructure. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, Canada's primary conduit to the Pacific coast, spans about 1,150 kilometers from the Edmonton Tank Farm in Alberta to the Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby, British Columbia. First commissioned in 1953 to transport crude oil, it later evolved to carry refined fuels such as gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. By 1993, it serviced multiple product types all the way to Vancouver. Ownership changed hands over time, culminating in the federal government's $4.5 billion purchase in 2018. Operated by the Trans Mountain Corporation, a Crown entity, the pipeline underwent a major expansion between 2019 and 2024, adding 987 kilometers of 36-inch pipe alongside the original route, new pump stations in Alberta and British Columbia, and major upgrades to the Westridge Terminal, enabling it to handle large Aframax and Panamax-class vessels. The pipeline's capacity increased from about 300,000 to 890,000 barrels per day, with mid-2025 volumes reaching between 750,000 and 800,000 barrels per day, enabling Canadian crude to access markets across the Asia-Pacific. Economists project that this increased throughput could generate $3 to $4 billion in annual toll revenue, depending on shipping contracts and commodity prices. Since it is Crown-owned, profits contribute directly to Canada's federal revenues, potentially helping reduce national debt. Despite the financial upside, the pipeline crosses environmentally sensitive zones like the Fraser River Delta, requiring close coordination with agencies such as Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the Canadian Coast Guard. To manage these risks, Trans Mountain Corporation maintains a comprehensive spill response strategy. Additionally, over 130 Indigenous communities are engaged in the project through various roles, from environmental monitoring to construction services, under benefit-sharing agreements aimed at ensuring mutual economic and cultural respect. Besides Trans Mountain, Canada's oil export network includes the Enbridge Canadian Main Line, a crucial west-to-east corridor that originates in Alberta and channels crude to Eastern Canadian and U.S. refineries. This system, capable of carrying nearly 3 million barrels per day, plays a vital role in connecting Alberta's oil fields to destinations like Sarnia, Ontario, and even as far as Montreal. Infrastructure improvements, such as the Line 3 replacement and Line 67 Alberta Clipper, have steadily raised capacity from 2.1 million barrels per day in 2010 to its current level. Though it lacks a direct link to tidewater, it remains indispensable for domestic and U.S.-bound oil distribution. As one of the top global oil producers, Canada's ambition to reach broader markets has been historically constrained by infrastructure limitations. As of late 2024, Canada produced about 5.4 million barrels per day of crude, with expectations to reach 5.6 million by late 2025. Nearly 90% of exports still go to the United States due to legacy pipeline networks. While TMX has made strides in expanding Canada's global reach, full diversification will likely require additional infrastructure, such as expanding TMX further or developing entirely new pipelines, all of which face regulatory, environmental, and investment hurdles. Shifting to natural gas, the LNG Canada project, a $40 billion joint venture between Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi, and Korea Gas Corporation, represents Canada's bold entry into global LNG markets. Situated near Kitimat, BC, the facility's Phase 1 will deliver 14 million tons per annum, MTPA, or 1.84 billion cubic feet per day, BCFD, to Asian markets. Its feedstock is secured through the Coastal GasLink pipeline, a 670-kilometer route from the Montney gas fields in northeast BC, which reached commercial operation in 2023 with a capacity of 2.1 BCFD. LNG Canada's exports are poised to serve major importers like Japan and South Korea under long-term agreements. Together, these projects represent a turning point, enabling Canada to move beyond its reliance on U.S. markets and emerge as a global supplier of LNG and oil, with a growing infrastructure base that aligns economic ambition with environmental responsibility. What do you think about this? Share your insights in the comments. And subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching.